Um, Hi, I'm Carolyn. I'm an addict.
Hi, Carolyn.
My clean date is October 5th, 2019. And at the time that I got sober on that day, it did not feel significant. It could have been any other day, honestly. And it wasn't something I premeditated. I got sober out of desperation and chose that day and stuck to it. And today that day means a lot to me. Well, I am from Chicago, Illinois. I'm very, very, very proud to be a Chicagoan. We're a rowdy bunch. I was born in the city of Chicago, and I was raised in the northwest suburbs in a town called Barrington, Illinois. I am one in a set of triplets. I have an identical twin sister and a fraternal twin brother. I also have an older sibling, Finley, in Germany. Leslie and Connor are my triplets. So I grew up in an abusive family, although, by all appearances, we seemed very put together. We were just kind of like that model family, that perfect family. But at home, it was very, very different. One of my parents has a personality disorder that is untreated, which led to a lot of neglect and abuse and manipulation and gaslighting. I also had a somewhat physically violent upbringing amongst several members of my family. So I grew up really, really depressed. I was depressed from as early as I can remember. I remember being in preschool and feeling depressed. I was bullied right off the bat. I was bullied from preschool all the way through college, and I ultimately dropped out of college due to the bullying. So I had a lot of reasons to be upset. So I was very, very depressed and, felt very distant from everybody at a really early age. I felt like there was this bubble between me and everyone else, and that I was jealous of other kids who could play and be happy because I didn't feel that way. And I had just this mask over my face that looked like my family, like this perfect kid, but I was very, very hurt inside. And as I grew up, the depression just got greater and greater until in middle school, I became suicidally depressed and didn't really know what to do with that. I just was fixated on death and terrified of it and consumed by it all the time. So when I got to high school, there was this social phenomenon that happened in my town called a suicide cluster. Basically, a suicide cluster is when there's a large amount of suicides within a community in a short span of time. And while I was in high school, we lost 10 kids. I knew 4 of them, and most of them jumped in front of trains. And it was, a really messed up way to grow up, and just kind of normalized suicide to me. And I think that emboldened me to want to try it myself because I had been so depressed for so long, and these other kids got away with it. And while it was this huge devastation within our community, I didn't really see myself as one of those kids because most of them were boys. I was a girl. They jumped in front of trains. I didn't want to do that. So I kind of didn't even think of myself as one of them, but I tried to kill myself when I was 17. I took a bunch of pills that I'd taken from my medicine cabinet and overdosed and blacked out, woke up in the ICU, got taken into the psych ward. And up until that point, I'd been a really good kid. I didn't drink, I didn't smoke weed, I didn't do anything. I wouldn't even smoke a cigarette. My friends all drank and smoked and partied, but they really respected that I didn't. And, when we'd go to parties, they'd put orange juice in my cups when we played beer pong because I was the sober kid. I was like the token sober kid. I'd always been the sober kid. So when I tried to kill myself and I didn't succeed, it left me with this weird feeling of, I don't want to be alive, but I don't want to die either. And so I just have to exist, and I don't want to feel anything, and I don't care about anything anymore. And all of my morals and values just went out the window because I just had this crushing apathy that, I didn't care anymore. And that's when I got into drugs. It started with drinking beer, which turned into, like cocktails that my mom's friend mixed us at a sleepover. Started smoking weed, I was just kind of falling apart really, really quickly. I started showing up to school high, ditching every single class I could, leaving school early, and, sneaking out every night to get high with my friends in some guy's garage. I was just falling apart. So after just a few months of my using career, I actually got expelled from high school. I got sent to my first treatment, which was a girls' boarding school in Vermont, Bromley Brook School for Girls. I hated it. I despised my family for sending me there. I hated that my uniform wasn't cool. I wanted like the little plaid skirt and the jacket, and I got a polo shirt and jeans. I didn't like that. But the one good thing that came out of boarding school was that we went to meetings all the time. And actually, my first home group was at the Bill Wilson House in Dorset, Vermont. It's where Bill Wilson was born and raised, and they have a meeting hall in his childhood home now, which was where I'd go to meetings. I didn't really care at first. I was really only going for the popcorn and because they had dogs. And that was really my motivation at the time. But the more I was going to those meetings, the more I was relating to these people and hearing my story come out of their mouths and being like, oh my God, that's exactly how I feel. I didn't think there was anyone on the planet who felt that way. So I really latched on to recovery. I was 18 and I was hooked on it. My second treatment was a transitional program for young adults. The young adult treatments are kind of different. They are very long-term, and the transitional one I was in was for like kids who'd been institutionalized and didn't grow up with the skills they needed, learning how to be a human, basically. Like they taught us how to do laundry, they taught us how to do groceries, they, put us in school, like all of the things that a kid misses out on when they're in treatment for so long. I was actually supposed to be in treatment for like 2.5 years, but after a year, I ran out of money, so I didn't finish. I actually moved to Oak Harbor. My mom had moved here, and I followed her, so that was going great. I was still sober, going to meetings, until my mom got cancer. She got stage 3 breast cancer. We're very lucky it wasn't stage 4. She was really, really, really sick. So she actually sent me back to Chicago to live with my grandparents. And not long after I moved to Chicago, I relapsed. I started hanging out with my old friends again. I, started going to the places that I used to go before, the whole people, places, and things. Well, as soon as I moved home, I fell right back into that, and it wasn't long before I was using again. And I went much harder this time because with every relapse, as one does, you just kind of go harder than the last. So it was really bad. I was in an abusive relationship with an addict who raped me on Thanksgiving and then assaulted his family with a knife when they tried to take away his pipe. It was a really traumatic event for me. But his mom told me that if I broke up with him, he would kill himself. So I stayed with him for another year. And in that time, I was just so broken and just shattered. But I didn't feel like there was any way out until my mom told me that I could break up with him and I could leave. So I fled. I took a geographical and went to Wyoming, where I went to college. That was where I was bullied really heavily, and so that didn't last long. I was kind of coming into symptoms of PTSD, which I didn't know at the time, and I was coping with drugs, which just sort of made the symptoms worse. So after I dropped out of college, I moved back to Oak Harbor once again to live with my mom, who had recovered from her cancer, thank God, and I went to therapy, found out I had PTSD, and did the one thing I knew how to do to cope, which was use drugs. It was really convenient because my mom was still on pain meds from cancer, which I took full advantage of, and my stepdad grew weed, which I also took full advantage of. So it was really easy for me to get drugs, and I would literally crawl on my hands and knees into their bedroom in the dead of night to steal my mom's pain meds. And I felt so horrible for that because she really needed them, but I couldn't stop myself. Like, I remember thinking, like, Carolyn, just turn around. You can turn around any second. You don't have to go through with this. You can stop yourself. Just turn around right now. And it was like I couldn't. Like, I was compelled to steal her drugs. I actually went into psychosis, and it was something that had happened before, but it had been really mild, and I knew I was hallucinating before, so I was able to articulate that I was having symptoms and got put on meds, but it was never diagnosed as anything. But this time, with my meds being mismanaged by a doctor who wasn't treating me correctly and the drugs I was using, I went like full-blown psychotic. I was so sick for like 2 years because no one knew what was going on with me. They just thought I was like not all there. I'm just curious because I'm always wondering, who here has had psychosis? Yep, that's a lot of people. Yeah, it's remarkably common in our community. So, I mean, I'm sure you guys can relate to just that fear of, like the voices talking to you and the things you're seeing and believing. It was the most horrifying experience of my life. And it was something that I felt was a fate worse than death. After I came out of it, I was so hollow and depressed, and it was really hard to regain a lot of the things I'd lost. It was like having to relearn how to talk and read and write again because it had affected my cognitive abilities. I swore to myself I would never, ever, ever do anything that would put me into psychosis again except quit using. And it's crazy because that was the one thing that would keep putting me back into psychosis, and it was the one thing I wouldn't stop. So I sobered up after my episode long enough to get into Oxford, and that's how I moved to Mount Vernon the first time and did really well in Oxford, but I never wanted to be sober. And I'll share something with you that I've never actually admitted, but I should probably hold myself accountable. I got away with using in Oxford, and I never got kicked out for it. I was really bad at hiding it too, but my house was just it wasn't running properly, so no one really noticed. But I would go to the bars every single night, and I would cheat when I'd write out, when I'd sign out, I would pretend to forget to sign out, and then no one would know how often I was actually out. And I'd get drunk at the bar and then remember that I had to sign out for an overnight so that I could stay out past 2, and then sloppily write my name in the log drunk off my butt coming home at like 2 a.m. And no one would be awake, so nobody caught me. I was doing mushrooms in Oxford. I was doing coke in Oxford. I can't believe I got away with it, and I honestly shouldn't have, and I don't recommend that at all. I definitely don't condone getting loaded in sober living. But yeah, I miraculously got away with it, and it was the dumbest thing I have ever done in my life because it led to just the worst experience. I eventually moved out of Oxford to move in with my alcoholic boyfriend, and that seemed super convenient at the time because we would just party constantly. We would either start our day at 11 a.m. at the brewery by the train station and start drinking around noon, or we would wait until like 5 p.m. and go to the town pump and start drinking there. Then at 9, we would go to Draft Picks and continue drinking there. Then when it would close at 2, we'd go back to our apartment with our friends and drink until 5 a.m. And of course, there were other drugs involved. It wasn't all drinking. But I got really sick of that because I didn't like people ruining my buzz. So I would just go get loaded in my bedroom. and go to sleep. And it really annoyed me that they'd party all night, because I was the responsible one. I had a job. I'd get up in the morning to go work as a dental assistant for my friend's canine dog teeth cleaning company. But there was really no difference between me and them other than the drugs I was using and the drugs they were using. We were exactly the same. And within a month of living there, we were evicted. And at that point, I had gone into another psychotic episode. So my life was fine. I didn't see anything wrong with that. Absolutely nothing at all. I continued on my merry way, couch surfing, hopping from one friend's couch to another, because so long as I had drugs, I was good. And in that time, I tried all sorts of fun things. I really enjoyed experimenting, and I genuinely didn't see a problem with this at all, because not only was I high all the time, I was a god. I was Jesus. I could jump through portals into other dimensions. I could see colors that don't exist, that I can't even describe, things that were pixelated and holographic. I mean, I was on top of the world. And that's when I met my ex-husband, who really, really enforced those delusions. And he would say, yeah, you are a god. We're both gods. And we're better than everyone. And everyone beneath us is like ants. And it's been so lonely, my whole life being the only god that I know, with all these peons everywhere. And so we were in this shared delusion that we were both gods. And he'd tell me this really messed up stuff, the most romantic thing he could think of is if we died in a plane crash together and stuff like that. And it was sick. He was really abusive, and it was really dark. And the worse the relationship got, the darker my delusions got, to the point where I, one night, had believed that I'd killed him. I had a delusion that I had killed him with an axe, and when I looked at him sleeping in bed, he was cut up into pieces, and it was terrifying. Up until this point, he wouldn't let me go to the psych ward. He said that he'd promised himself he'd never take me there, so I had just stayed in this really bad, acute psychosis for months, getting worse and worse and worse. And when I saw him like that, cut up on the bed, I just freaked out. I thought I was a killer, and it is the worst feeling to think you're a murderer and just panicking, not knowing what to do. And so I ran away from home. I ran away. We were in Burlington, in this farm area, and I just ran through these fields until I came across a pickup truck. And there was a guy saying, "What are you doing here? You can't be here." It was 5 a.m., and he actually hitched me a ride into Burlington. And when I got to Burlington, I just kept wandering around some more until I ran into a cop. And I went up to the cop and I confessed that I'd killed my husband. And thankfully, she didn't take me to the station. She took me to the hospital, and I was put into the hospital. And when I got there, it was terrifying. I'm in this padded, I'm on this padded mat on the ground. There's no bed or anything. I'm just in this room, this blank room with just brick walls, those white painted walls. And then I'm just hearing screaming, the worst blood curdling screaming of my life. And it sounded like my ex-husband screaming that they were ruining his creation, and I was this creation, and that they were going to tear me apart. And it was just so terrifying. Everything about that experience was so terrifying. But the good thing that came out of that is because I ran away from home, I did get into a psych ward and I did get medicated. And my God, I am so grateful that I did that, because I don't know what I would have done with my life if I hadn't gotten out of that situation. I came out of psychosis. I got sober. I left that marriage. I had an annulment because I was deemed mentally incapacitated and I couldn't consent to marriage. So it was devastating, and it seemed like the best motivation to get sober and stay sober, because I never wanted to go back to that. So I went back to Oxford. And I didn't really want to be sober, but I was in Oxford. I didn't want my life circumstances to come back. I just wanted to use without consequences, but I stayed sober for a while. And after about a year, realized that I just didn't feel like it anymore. I didn't want to be sober, and I figured, like, I've proved to everyone I can do this thing for a whole year, so I've graduated. And I had plans of relapsing. I had plans of relapsing after my 1 year. But then I met John, and he changed everything. I wasn't super into him at first because I met him at a meeting, and so like he comes into this meeting and he is just sharing really well, and I wanted to compliment him, and then suddenly he's texting me all the time. And like I just was like, no, shut it down. So I turned him down. I turned him down hardcore, but he was just a good friend. He realized that I wasn't into him, and he just became my friend. And we would walk everywhere together, and we'd walk to meetings together. We'd, walk to my place together. I lived in Big Lake at the time, and we'd walk all the way to Big Lake from here. And we just started walking and talking and became friends, and it turned into a relationship. And I relapsed in the beginning of that relationship without telling him, and I kept it a secret from him, which I'm sure he caught on to very quickly. But I didn't see a problem with that because my addiction was stronger than my feelings, I thought, except that when he did find out, it occurred to me that I might lose him, and then I felt frantic because I didn't want to lose him, and I didn't want to lose my mind either, and the psychosis was coming back, and I just was panicked. I freaked out. I honestly wouldn't be sober without John because he motivated me to be sober. I didn't want to be sober until I met John, and losing him scared me so much that I was willing to get sober initially to save our relationship, but ultimately it turned into something I did for myself. When we first started dating, and I did get sober, and he all of a sudden had more time than me, and we're going to meetings, we would literally walk 20 miles every day to go to meetings. We'd walk 7 miles from Big Lake to our first meeting at 11:30 a.m., and then we'd walk around until PM rush, and then we'd walk around until a 7 p.m. meeting, and then we'd walk back. And it would take hours to get to a single meeting. It would take like 2.5 hours to get to our first meeting. But we did that every day because I just had to get out of Big Lake. I was living with alcoholics, and I didn't, I had to for my recovery. It didn't feel like I had a choice. It was like what I had to do. And those were the first links I took. People were dying right off the bat when I got sober. One of my friends died within my first 30 days, and I was devastated by that. And then my grandpa died when I had 5 months. My dog died when I had 11 months. And I was psychotic the first 6-ish months. I was hospitalized 3 times. I was suicidal. I mean, it was a really rough year. It was hard. And I really struggled through that. I didn't want to be sober, but I didn't want to relapse. And I realized that the only thing worse than what I was already going through was a relapse. So it motivated me to stay sober. My second year was really hard too, because I started having really bad behavioral problems and rage and these episodes that would just set off like that. And it turns out that I had borderline personality disorder, which had pretty much been suppressed by my drug use. And it all came out in sobriety. And all of a sudden I was hospitalized again. And I had all of these big challenges right off the bat. I had loss, I had grief. My dog died in my arms. I had psychosis, I had BPD. There was a pandemic. That was a thing. It was so hard. And I hated sobriety. I felt like, why is my life worse now that I'm sober? And I was just so desperate for any kind of spiritual connection, and I was just not finding it. I felt like I was bashing my head into a wall trying to figure out spirituality and was getting nothing. So I was hanging on by a thread those first 3.5 years. until one day I was with John and we were walking around like Skagit Valley College, and out of nowhere, I just got like struck by this like bolt of lightning of inspiration or like an epiphany or something. I had this complete 180-degree like change in me out of nowhere, where all of a sudden I was thinking different, I was perceiving different, like my view of the world was different, my view of myself was different. I was entirely changed in like an instant. And it was like I didn't have anything to worry about anymore. I stopped worrying about the future and told myself, like, if I ever have to worry about the future, I'll worry about it when I get there. But until then, it's not relevant. And so I don't stress as much about future tripping like I used to. I don't think about things like that anymore. I don't think that way anymore. Like, I realized to myself that all this time I'd been trying to find a spiritual connection, I had just been bashing my head into all intellectualizing it, trying to overthink it, trying to make sense of it. And it's not something that I could make sense of, and I felt it was not something I'm supposed to make sense of. I thought to myself, Carolyn, you are a human, mortal, and it is so presumptuous of you to knock up to the gates of knowledge and demand for more knowledge, because you're human. You're not supposed to get it until you're ready for it. And until you're ready for it, don't worry about it. Like, don't try to seek anything before you can handle it. It'll come to you when you're ready. And until then, just have faith that you'll get there and it'll come to you when you're ready. Like, don't worry. So it made me feel a lot better. I just all of a sudden had this very sound feeling of like trust and faith. And I felt so peaceful knowing what I knew then, which is that I didn't need to know anything. And I felt so content in just having belief in a question mark and being okay with the rest of it unraveling itself along the way. There have been more moments like spiritually that have kind of put more pieces together in this undone puzzle that I'm working on spiritually. Like, I've had a few moments that were so overwhelming that were just spontaneous emotional like bursts where all of a sudden I'd just be completely overtaken by this spiritual feeling and presence, where I would both be like mourning for myself but also celebrating myself at the same time, and have these dualities of like, you know, thanking God profusely and praying, thank you, while also just being in awe of where I've come from and how I got there and how completely daunting it is and how I got to this place, like after all I'd been through, and how I shouldn't have even survived it, and what a miracle it is that all of my life lined up this way, that I was able to survive it and get to this point. My spirituality is a lot better today, and it's seriously the game changer that I needed. Like I didn't have much. I mean, I had some recovery in the sense that I'd worked the steps multiple times. I had sponsees, like I was doing the thing, I had service positions, but until I found spirituality, I had just like a very limited scope of recovery. And today, everything I do is guided by that shift that happened in me, that's changed who I am and changed how I see the world and how I bring myself into interactions, how I bring myself into relationships, like how I handle situations which used to baffle me, for instance. You know, I still work on it. It's not something that I've like got, right? I am struggling right now in my steps because I am stupidly working 2 rounds of steps at the same time in 2 fellowships, and it's really hard to do that, and I wouldn't recommend that either. I've been working step 5 with one sponsor, and I'm on step 2 with another sponsor after having done a different round. I mean, it's just crazy, but I'm able to do these things today because I've worked so hard to get to this point. I don't think I would have had my spiritual experience if I hadn't worked so hard for the cosmos to line up in such a way that I would be granted that knowledge that I wasn't ready for before. Like, that's truly what I believe. I believe that I had to prepare myself for this. I don't believe that I was just given the life I have because I don't know, like earned it or, you know, wanted it bad enough. Like, I worked for it. I worked really hard for it. I worked through 10 deaths for it because I've lost 10 people in recovery. I've lost at least one person a year ever since I got sober. 4 people my first year, 4 people my second, 3 my third, and 1 my fourth, and now I'm in my I don't even know anymore. Well, has it been more than 10?
Yeah.
It's been a lot. Like, grief has been a huge part of my recovery, but I learned through people in the program and watching how they handled these things, how to handle it myself. Like, this community is so huge to me because until I was a part of a community, I didn't know how to operate. I didn't know how to live life on life's terms. And it's through the people around me, people with more time or less time, that I've been able to learn how to have a functional, meaningful life. I wouldn't have that without this program. And I wouldn't have it without my sponsor, my sponsees, and without the steps, without my relationship. Like, it's a miracle that I'm sober, and it's no small feat. And it took so many tries to finally figure out how to string more than 30 days together. But I finally have, and I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for this gift that I've been given, that I worked so hard for. I mean, it truly is, I can't say it enough, it's a miracle. Anyway, that's kind of what I've been through, and I'm grateful to share my story for you. Thanks for listening. That's all I got.